JJ Stankevitz here on Sports Talk Chicago. JJ, what's wrong with the Bears right now?
Boy, how long do you got? Let's start here. I think they've made some. I think they've made some smart hires on their coaching staff. Whether it was Sean Desai, I think was a pretty smart outside the box hire. But I can't get this thought out of my head, John, that they have not been able to dip into a deep pool of coaches to bring on now for 2 consecutive years. Like the coaches who they are hiring to replace the folks who have been fired or left has not been very deep. And that doesn't mean you can't find a good coach in that. But, a year ago, Juan Castillo was out of the game for a year. Clancy Barone was out of the game for a year. Bill Lazor was an analyst at Penn State. They weren't hiring the top level, like, oh my God, they got that guy people. And I think that's what's happening again with the Bears here. Like, they're not a destination for coaches who want to come somewhere where they're going to be stable, because no one knows if Matt Nagy is going to have a job after this year. So to me, that's kind of a worrying start to a very critical offseason for this franchise. And then, I'm sure we'll get into the Carson Wentz stuff, but the other kind of pit of my stomach feeling I have about this team is that they're going to make a move that is designed to bring short-term gains, but will set them back as a franchise for a couple of years, because Ryan Pace is kind of in an untenable situation. Like, the Bears are their path to contending in the NFC, being legit Super Bowl contenders, is very narrow. It is a very, very difficult path to navigate. And Pace is basically being told you have to navigate it in a year. And I don't see how this ends well for the Chicago Bears. But I could be wrong. I could be totally wrong about it. But I just, my overarching feeling is I don't quite see how this ends well for the Bears.
Do you see any upside whatsoever in acquiring Carson Wentz?
Yeah. I think there is the possibility for it. Even if you go back and look at what Wentz did in 2019, it wasn't like it was a complete disaster,
right?
Like it was in 2020. Last year, 2019, Wentz had a 93.1 passer rating, a 62.8 QBR. It's not great. It was only 7 yards per attempt, but like 27 touchdowns, 7 interceptions, like you can be okay with that. The problem is that, like, I think the expectation will be that you get Wentz back to 2017 Wentz, which, when you're 4 years removed from that, that's not a very likely outcome here. But also, Carson Wentz was one of the worst starting quarterbacks in the NFL. It was really him and Nick Foles who were the worst starters in the NFL in 2020. And, you're trading for a guy who led the NFL in interceptions, led the NFL in sacks taken, who just looked broken for so much of last year. And you can convince yourself that maybe a change of scenery, will be the thing that gets him back to being a good quarterback. But are you willing to bet a first round pick or two on that? Man, I don't know. Even if you restructure his contract, that it is just a very, very tenuous bet to bet on Carson Wentz. It is the kind of bet that, look, if it goes wrong, you are saddled with the ramifications of that for not just 2021, but 22, 23, maybe even 24. Whereas, you could probably go get a lower risk quarterback who doesn't have as much upside. That's the problem, again, is that Pace kind of has to go for the upside here. And talking yourself into Wentz and his upside is something I could very well see the Bears doing. It's just, again, if it goes wrong, we're going to be in this city. We're not going to really be watching a winning football team for quite some time if it doesn't work out.
Is this a fireable offense? Do you think next year? I mean, if things don't work out with Wentz, Pace is going to be gone, right?
Well, yeah, and if things don't work out with whoever the quarterback is, he's going to be gone. That's the thing. So they could go get a kind of lower tier, cheaper option at quarterback. But if you do that, is it really going to work out? Like, if the Bears, say even they keep Nick Foles and they draft a quarterback in the first round, let's say it's Mac Jones. Like, are you really staking your future as the Bears general manager on Mac Jones as a rookie in 2020? That's the thing. Like, I feel like there's just not a good option for the Bears, save trading for Deshaun Watson, which seems pretty unlikely. And it's a really, really tough spot for Ryan Pace, which is why I think, we'll probably look back in a year and wonder why the Bears just didn't get on with it and start over now, because it feels like they put their GM in a really difficult spot, and one that's very difficult to get out of under the parameters that they likely have set, that notion of progress. And by delaying the inevitable for a year, and basically by giving your GM an impossible task to complete, you're delaying the inevitable by a year, but you're also worsening the inevitable for the next couple of years by giving him the green light to go make an aggressive move to try to show progress. I can talk about this, but ultimately it comes down to, I don't think Ryan Pace can win, and that could lead the Bears to be in a really bad spot for the next couple of years.
Why not keep Mitch Trubisky? Do you think that's an option?
I think that ship kind of sailed when the Bears got knocked out of the playoffs by the Saints. If Matt Nagy's not going to trust Mitch Trubisky against the Packers and the Saints, then what are we doing here? Let's just move on. Let's not go back to that well because you think you can fix him. I think the Mitch Trubisky era kind of ran its course and came to a natural conclusion back in January when the Bears lost to the Saints. Even if you get a quarterback who is at the level of Mitch Trubisky, the fact that it's not Mitch would probably be an upgrade because Matt Nagy is still here.
What about Deshaun Watson? On a scale of 1 to 10, how likely is it the Bears acquire him?
I think like a 3. Never say never on it, but I also think that this, it's going to be, it seems like the Texans are going to drag this out. And they're not going to look to trade Watson right now because they don't have to. They can kind of play, a game of chicken with him and see if he really isn't going to show up to training camp. And that's in July. So this is something that could happen in August or even September, right before the season. And there are going to be teams that don't need a quarterback that can be like, well, all right, I guess we can go into the season with Derek Carr or, something along those lines. And then if Deshaun Watson actually becomes available, well, holy crap, all right, we better go get him. The Bears, because they don't have that security in their front office or their coaching staff, they need to address quarterback. I mean, if they get to the draft and Nick Foles is the only quarterback on their roster, you can't wait for Deshaun Watson. So it's look, if the Texans trade Deshaun Watson before free agency or the draft, I might up that to a 4. But I kind of get the sense that they're going to hang on to him for a while. Wentz will be traded, Sam Darnold will be traded, and the quarterback carousel will kind of move on with teams that need a quarterback getting a quarterback. And then teams that are willing to wait and, have a shot at Watson but are okay with the guy they have in place, those are the teams that will ultimately be in the running for him. And I don't think the Bears are one of those teams.
Here's a hypothetical. Let's say Watson gets traded in August, right before the season. Let's say he goes to the Raiders or another team who has an okay quarterback, and they get Watson. Could the Bears then, around that time, swoop in and get that quarterback that was replaced by Watson? Could that happen?
Theoretically, but I think by the time, that rolls around, the Bears are going to be pretty set with who they have at quarterback. If they trade for Carson Wentz, they're stuck with him. Right. There's no getting out from him. If they draft like maybe, yeah, if they draft Mac Jones and they get to August and, okay, we're not trading for Watson, but like 3-team trade, we can get Derek Carr. Like, okay, all right, we'll go get Derek Carr. He's got a very favorable contract. This will allow us to kind of really evaluate the young quarterback we have on our roster, and not have to start him for a year. I think that would make a little more sense than going kind of all in on Deshaun Watson when you've kind of already made your bed with whoever your young quarterback is going to be. But I think that's still pretty unlikely. You can kind of talk yourself into it a little bit, but I think it's pretty unlikely that the Bears get to August and say, all right, time to change quarterbacks.
What's your expectation then for next season for the Bears?
I mean, they're not going to finish last in the North because the Lions are going through a big old teardown. But I don't think they're a playoff team. And, some things could break right on defense. They could get the right scheme in there with Sean Desai, and they're still very talented on that side of the ball. Defense can win you 6, 7, 8 games. So, it all kind of depends on, I guess, what shakes out on the offensive side of the ball, starting with quarterback. But will Allen Robinson be back? What are they going to do with the offensive line? How does that look? Because the Bears also don't have a ton of resources here to go out and grab a top-tier right tackle, either in the draft or in free agency. You can get a pretty good one in the draft probably, but are you going to get someone who's going to be a transcendent talent who fixes your offensive line? I don't know about that. And the Bears' schedule next year looks pretty tough. Playing the AFC North, which doesn't look like that'll be a very easy path for them. I hate to say it. I think you're looking at like 6-10, 7-9, and another season where you're just kind of like, this isn't very fun. But hey, I mean, look, it's so early in the off season right now that a lot could go the Bears' way. And because they have decided to set forward with Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy again, I think we need to see where it goes. I don't know if those guys have the benefit of the doubt. I think they've probably lost it over the last couple of years, but there's not no reason to hope, I guess. The Bears are still an 8-8 team. Like 8-8 is not as bad as we've seen it get here in Chicago. And to improve off of 8-8, sometimes you just need some good luck, and maybe the Bears will get lucky next year.